Chapter 2. Catching a Convict. All that morning, I was frightened that my sister would discover that I had stolen from her. But luckily, she was so busy cleaning the house and roasting the chickens for our Christmas lunch that she did not notice that I had been out or that any food was missing. At 1:30, our 2 guests arrived. Mr. Wopsle had a large nose and a shining bald forehead, and was the church clerk. Mr. Pumblechook, who had a shop in the nearest town, was a fat, middle-aged man, with a mouth like a fish and staring eyes. He was really Joe's uncle, but it was Mrs. Joe who called him uncle. Every Christmas Day he arrived with 2 bottles of wine, handing them proudly to my sister. "Oh, Uncle Pumblechook, this is kind," she always replied. "It's no more than you deserve," was the answer every time. Sitting at table with these guests, I would have felt uncomfortable, even if I hadn't robbed my sister. Not only was Pumblechook's elbow in my eye, but I wasn't allowed to speak, and they gave me the worst pieces of meat. Even the chickens must have been ashamed of those parts of their bodies when they were alive. And worse than that, the adults never left me in peace. "Before we eat, let us thank God for the food in front of us," said Mr. Wopsle, in the deep voice he used in church. "Do you hear that?" whispered my sister to me. "Be grateful." "Especially," said Mr. Pumblechook firmly, "be grateful, boy, to those who brought you up by hand." "Why are the young never grateful?" wondered Mr. Wopsle, sadly. "Their characters are naturally bad," answered Mr. Pumblechook, and all 3 looked unpleasantly at me. When there were guests, Joe's position was even lower than usual, if that was possible. But he always tried to help me if he could. Sometimes he comforted me by giving me extra gravy. He did that now. "Just imagine, boy," said Mr. Pumblechook, "if your sister hadn't brought you up—" "You listen to this," said my sister to me crossly. "If, as I say, she hadn't spent her life looking after you, where would you be now?" Joe offered me more gravy. "He was a lot of trouble to you, madam," Mr. Wopsle said, sympathetically to my sister. "Trouble?" she cried. "Trouble?" And then she started on a list of all my illnesses, accidents, and crimes, while everybody except Joe looked at me with disgust. Joe added more gravy to the meat swimming on my plate, and I wanted to pull Mr. Wopsle's nose. In the end, Mrs. Joe stopped for breath and said to Mr. Pumblechook, "Have a little brandy, Uncle. There is a bottle already open." It had happened at last. Now she would discover I had stolen some brandy and put water in the bottle. Mr. Pumblechook held his glass up to the light, smiled importantly at it, and drank it. When, immediately afterwards, he jumped up and began to rush round the room in a strange, wild dance, we all stared at him in great surprise. Was he mad? I wondered if I had murdered him, but if so, how? At last, he threw himself gasping into a chair, crying, "Medicine!" Then I understood. Instead of filling up the brandy bottle with water, I had put Mrs. Joe's strongest and most unpleasant medicine in by mistake. That was what the big brown bottle contained. "But how could my medicine get into a brandy bottle?" asked my sister. Fortunately, she had no time to find the answer, as Mr. Pumblechook was calling for a hot rum to remove the taste of the medicine. "And now," she said, when the fat man was calmer. "You must all try Uncle Pumblechook's present to us, a really delicious meat pie." "That's right, Mrs. Joe," said Mr. Pumblechook, looking more cheerful now. "Bring in the pie." "You shall have some, Pip," said Joe, kindly. I knew what would happen next. I could not sit there any longer. I jumped down from the table and ran out of the room.